All right, I want to welcome everybody into the Fifth Dimension podcast with me, Evan McDermott. For today's show, I was joined by Mark Weber. Mark is a historian and author and the founder of Institute for Historical Review. He's also one of the most censored men on the planet. Been censored for a long time. They've been coming after the Institute for a long time for the type of work that he has been doing. And he's a true historian. Whether you agree with him or not on certain issues, I think we all got to respect the approach that he takes and really his devotion and seeking of truth. And ultimately, what we discussed was the mythos and the mythology of World War II and looking at a lot of the unquestioned narratives regarding the motivations and interests of, and particularly of the Allied forces and what came out of this war and the impact that it has on society today. So this is an informative conversation, and I think you guys will enjoy this one. Hopefully you do as much as I did. And certainly, I hope this is not the last chat I have with Mark. I really enjoyed this one. And, there's so many different avenues and rabbit holes that you could go down when beginning to unpack World War II. And this is really a great introductory uh, to the subject to actually start asking these deeper questions. So thank you, Mark, for coming on. And I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you're a fan of the show, be sure to subscribe, whatever platform you are on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Rumble. Certainly, this episode might be dealing with some censorship itself. Just with Mark, the name alone, Mark Weber, and put that up on YouTube. We'll see how long it lasts. Be sure to subscribe, whatever platform you are on. It does help the show and more people find the show. Also, head on over to my Substack, mcdermott.substack.com, mcdermod.substack.com. And shout out to all of the new subscribers over there. Had quite an influx of new subscribers on Substack in the last couple of weeks. So shout out to everybody over there. I do appreciate you guys for tuning in. And you can also, if you want to work with me one-on-one, offering a new tarot program, 12-week course going through the stages of the hero's journey where we meet once a week. Really great value for the price that it's at right now. If you want to book that, it is in the episode show notes below. And also special thank you to our one and only sponsor, Tranquil Desires, here in Chamberlain, South Dakota, your one-stop shop for all your holistic wellness and spiritual needs. Also, I forgot to mention, The Final Judgment, my poetry book, for a limited time is available as a free ebook. A free ebook. The link to download will be in the description below. So if you're interested in some poetry, I just want to put the poems out there. You can leave a tip if you want. Certainly not obligated to, but it's free. Just download. You don't have to sign up for anything to download. So feel free to get yourself a copy if you want to read some poetry. Well, let's jump into the conversation with Mark Weber. Enjoy. All right, everybody, welcome into the Fifth Dimension podcast. For today's show, I am joined by Mark Weber. He is a historian, author, and founder of the Institute for Historical Review. And Mark was being censored and deplatformed really before that was a popular thing in today's world. So, Mark, really a pleasure to be able to connect, and thanks for taking the time to come on the show.
Happy to be with you.
All right. And, I'd love to start if you could just kind of give a little bit before we jump into the theme. I know we have some ideas in mind, looking at World War II and sort of the mythos behind it. But I wanted to start if you could kind of give a synopsis of your work for any of the listeners who maybe aren't familiar with what you do. And I mean, obviously, I would hope by now most of my listeners know not to use Google as their main search engine. But I mean, if they type your name in on Google, I mean, you have things like the Southern Poverty Law Center and all the labels that they throw under the sun, right? So it doesn't really paint an accurate picture of what it is that you actually do. So
I appreciate you said that because I've written to both the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League to correct some especially outrageous falsehoods on each of their descriptions of what we do.
mhm,
And they don't reply, they don't change anything. That's the way it goes.
mhm.
I use Google myself a lot for if you want to know the distance between the Earth and the Moon, or
Right.
the geological ages, or differences between different species of flowers. Google and Wikipedia can be very useful. But when it comes to what they call controversial issues, Google can be very misleading, and Wikipedia as well. That's not just something I say, that's been confirmed by quite a few other people, and I'm sure many of your viewers and listeners know that as well. Um, uh, I try very much to talk about history as it's relevant to the times we live in, and to talk about events that are happening in our age from a historical perspective.
Mm.
And I do that. I would say that there's much more openness now to what I say, and I think what you would agree, than there was 10 or 20 years ago. And the reason for that is that there's been an enormous shift in the public's trust in our institutions.
Mm.
I think it's fair to say that American society, Western society, is in a real crisis. And so people are far less willing to believe what the official, quote unquote, view about almost anything happens to be. Now,
Mm.
that's both bad and good. It's good if we've been misled, but it's also bad because now people are very confused about who to believe about anything. So
Mm.
there's an awful lot of nonsense out there too, by people who are well-meaning, but they don't know who to trust anymore. And we just went through an election campaign. I don't think there's ever been an election campaign in American history where so many Americans, including myself, are so unhappy with the choice. I mean, the election of 1860 was a very contentious one, but the people who voted liked someone they were voting for.
Mm.
I've never known an election in American history when people have been so unhappy with either of the candidates, either of the major candidates, or even the minor ones, but certainly the major ones.
Mm.
And those are signs of a really difficult time in the history of a society, a nation, however you want to put it. And the reason I think that there's more openness is because people are very confused. How come it is that a country that, when I was young, was sort of on top of the world, preeminent country, a kind of model for much of the world, Americans were very proud, has become a country that Americans are, many of them, very ashamed of. And of course, we look around us, we see homelessness, we see a great deal of things breaking down. It's a social institutions and so forth are distrusted, and nobody knows why exactly, and we don't know how it got from there to here. How did this happen?
Mm.
And anyone with any kind of sense of history cannot help but be struck. And this is it might sound superficial, but if you go back and look at speeches and addresses by American leaders in the past, and of course, world leaders, it's really striking how Abraham Lincoln, or even those who against him, could speak in complete sentences. They could make a coherent argument. They developed their thoughts with sentences and paragraphs in a consistent way. They appealed to reason, or at least logic, in how they spoke. American politics and much of American public discourse has become just so characterized by name calling, slogans, cheap shots,
Mm.
and even those who supposedly present rational arguments do so very superficially, just a few sentences and this and this, and that's it. And those are all signs in which increasingly political leaders and much of our public discourse is driven by sort of what side you're on and by emotion. Anyway, to
Mm.
get to what we were going to talk about during this session, I've written quite a lot about the Second World War. And the reason I do is because the world that America was preeminent in during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s is the world of the post-war age, the post-war order that was set
Mm.
up after World War II. And for many American leaders, I think Donald Trump and Biden share this in common. They both think that the American preeminence and American stature in the world during those periods when they were growing up or when they were young was the norm. That's the way
Mm.
the world should be. We should have a country that America is looked upon with respect. Americans are proud of their country. We're on top of things. There's a choice between America and the sort of despicable Soviet Union. The choice is pretty clear. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. Um, and that's the world that many Americans think is the norm. And what I've tried to emphasize in my writings is that's not the norm. That's a very abnormal situation in human history.
Mm-hmm.
And especially because at the end of World War II, America was preeminent, not because we're better in some moral way or because God has sort of decided America's the country that is going to be in charge. It's because America was the one country that came out of the Second World War that was not destroyed in the war
Mm-hmm.
or was already way behind. Um, I mean, right now, America has a tremendous rivalry with China. Well, in World War II, China was just devastated. Much of it was occupied by Japan. And even after the war, China was rent by a terrible civil war between the communist nationalists. And so China was just on its back. I mean, it was one of the poorest countries in the world in the 1940s and 50s. Uh, and America was on top at a time when, after World War II, Europe was on its back. I mean, Europe had been devastated. Of course, Germany, the most important industrial country in Europe, was devastated. Japan had been completely destroyed in the war, but the rest of Europe also was down. That's all changed. The rest of the world has not only caught up, in many ways, it's better off than the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Many American leaders, including independently, both Biden and Trump, have on different occasions have made the observation that when they go on a foreign visit and come back in an airplane to the United States and land in an American airport, in an American city, they feel like they've come to a third world country. American airports are sort of notoriously chaotic and disorganized and not as well organized as airports in other countries. Now, that's a superficial thing, but it's just one sign of how things have changed. One point I'd like to make very often, just to portray how different things are. Right after World War II, um, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler made something like 90% of the world's automobiles. Detroit was
Mm-hmm.
the center of the world automobile industry. American automobiles dominated the world. Today, the two largest automobile companies are Toyota and Volkswagen. And China today, every day, makes more automobiles than the United States and Japan combined by far. And it looks like China is poised or is already just absolutely dominant in the world electric car industry. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's many other examples, but I'm only giving this as just one of the markers of how different the world is. When I was a boy, the 10 largest banks in the world were all American banks. Now, none of the top 10 are American banks. Those are just some of the examples. And even it was during the Reagan years that America shifted from being the number one creditor nation in the world to the number one debtor nation in the world. And in recent decades, both the Republican and Democratic Party have kept up America's place in the world or our standard of living, however you want to put it, by just enormously increasing the national debt. And America can do that because the dollar is still the world's reserve currency. That's also a legacy of the Second World War. Now,
Mm-hmm.
there's other things that I get into and have on many writings emphasized how the Second World War put America on this trajectory, both in domestic terms and in international terms. One of the legacies of the Second World War, which I have emphasized a great deal, is this idea that we're the good guys, and so we have a kind of warrant to make other countries better and be the kind of world policeman. That was the
Mm-hmm.
kind of idea that Americans accepted for years until it went bad, until especially the Vietnam War was an enormous fiasco. And the Vietnam War was based on this idea that Americans had is we've got to stop bad guys and we're going to stand up for freedom around the world. Well, the world isn't like that. The world isn't divided into good guys and bad guys. And this tendency to see the world in terms of almost like a football team, except there's good guys and bad guys, or a Superman comic book, is a very dangerous one.
Mm-hmm.
And Americans are very unhappy or confused by this because if the world isn't good guys and bad guys, what is the basis that we make foreign policy? How should we deal in the world? And the truth is, and I try to emphasize that, especially from a historical point of view, the world has to get along in terms of interests and who we are. We have to, we may dislike and very much the way some countries do things. I mean, none of us are, there's many countries, for example, that are very religious in their politics. They bring their, I'm personally, I don't think that's a great idea, but
Hmm.
that's not unusual in history or around the world. And we might not like it, but that doesn't make them bad countries. That doesn't make their people bad. Indeed, American history is, for much of American history, the policies that this country had internally, domestically, would be considered terrible if any country did them today. I mean, there's just many examples of that, of course. Anyway, my point is that having a more realism-based view of the world and how countries get along or should deal with each other requires also a reevaluation of the Second World War. The two are very closely related. And I've quoted any number of historians who make this point that America came out of the Second World War with a kind of hubris, a kind of arrogance. We're the good guys, and war should end with we're in charge, the other guys are defeated, they surrender, they give up, we tell them what to do, and then we go home again. That's it. That's a very unusual thing. And also, even how Americans look at the Second World War is not even accurate just as an objective thing about the American role in the Second World War. I'm not the only one who has pointed out, many others have pointed out, that the the countries that played the biggest role militarily in defeating Germany, Hitler's Germany, was the United States, but even more the Soviet Union. But Americans don't like to think like that. They like to think, well, we defeated the Soviet Union. Well, of course, the United States did, but the Soviet Union was far more important in terms of actually killing German soldiers and
Hmm.
defeating German military forces. But that's difficult for Americans to quite understand because Hollywood and our leaders have emphasized the American role, which is understandable, but it skews, it distorts the reality of the Second World War because Americans like to believe, I guess it's a common thing, good guys win, bad guys lose. We won the World War II. We're the good guys. Well, what do you expect? Good guys win. That's the way movies
Hmm.
end. That's the way Superman deals in the world. And that's the way everybody would like things to be. But the world isn't like that. Good guys, quote unquote, don't always win. Sometimes they do so. And in fact, are they really good guys? And when we look through history, we find many, many wars, and it's very hard to say who the good guys and bad guys are. When
Hmm.
Carthage is fighting Rome, is Carthage inferior to Rome in moral terms? Well, no. I mean, I don't think anybody would say that. Or when the Roman Empire is expanding, are the Gauls or the people in Spain or other countries, are they inferior? No, I mean, that's kind of silly. And we've had to really reevaluate all those things and think differently about that because especially in the last 30, 40 years, America's military role overseas has been a really bad one, a catastrophic one, a bad one in Iraq or Afghanistan. And there we give other examples. And right now, where America public opinion has really shifted enormously.
Hmm.
And I think it's fair to say now that the vast majority of Americans are really very unhappy about our country being involved overseas, especially because Americans feel we've got such problems here at home. And that's reflected in any number of public opinion polls.
Right.
Anyway, so anyway, that's my kind of introduction, you might say, to what I think is important in understanding the world we live in, what I've tried to emphasize. And it comes across to many people as un-American or critical of America. Well, that's true. It is. It's critical source of policies of the United States. And I try to say it's not because American leaders are evil or bad. It's because their worldview is based upon a flawed view about history and about life.
Mm.
And it's not enough to have good intentions. Policies have to be based on a realistic understanding of ourselves and other countries. No, because even people that are well intentioned can carry out policies and make policies that are terrible in their consequences for people. So that's a kind of introduction to what I want to points I'm trying to make and what I'm trying to do.
For sure. And I think that's a good segue into our conversation, particularly about World War II. Because, what's interesting is when we look at something like Vietnam or we look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we do sort of see that more acceptable scrutiny and questioning and actual, like, okay, what is our actual role here, right? And the whole moral framework of it, it's not settled in that idea of like you were talking about, right? We're not necessarily the good guys when we're going over into Afghanistan or Iraq and destroying their country, or in Vietnam doing the same thing. But yet when we look at World War II, and this is something, you know, I I find fascinating myself because, I come from a history teaching background, working in schools, and they're always hammering this point home about World War II in the school system, about this being the moral frameworks of this war is that it's almost holy in its nature. Like it is what we need to do. We're being called by God to go over and defeat evil in its purest form. All right, that's very much the story, and I think
Right.
the mythos of World War II as a whole. And because of that, I don't think the war itself and the actions and motivations and intentions that led to a lot of the decisions and outcomes of that war, a lot of those aren't actually discussed because we just assume the whole thing in itself was an act of virtue. And so I'm kind of wondering how was it that this war got framed in that light, and like what is the in your eyes the reasoning and the motivation behind that, and the reason we still uphold that story. And if we start talking about it, you see how they label your group, for example, or if somebody starts talking about these ideas, they're called a revisionist, or if you talk about the Holocaust, you're a Holocaust denier. It's like all of these different ideas you're not even really allowed to discuss. So like
Right.
what's the motivation behind that of
Well, there's,
upholding
I think,
this?
a couple of factors. One of the important one is to justify America getting into the war, it has to be put in this very stark good guy, bad guy way, because the United States could have stayed out of World War II.
Hmm.
It was not essential the United States get involved in World War II. Germany was Hitler and Germany had no designs on the United States. In fact, it's really, I mean, again, this is an astonishing thing for many people. They find it hard to believe. They believe a bad person is sort of insatiable. He's crazy. He's going to just do terrible things. I mean, and the truth is, Hitler's goals in 1939, 1940 were very specific. He didn't want war with England or Britain. He didn't want war with France. He certainly didn't even imagine war with the United States. There was no reason for war with the United States. In 1939, Germany attacked Poland over very specific issues dealing with Danzig and so forth. You can find much more on our website and our books we sell about the details of that. Um, and yeah, I mean, I don't think it was good that he attacked Poland, but this was not an attack against France or Britain. It was a limited war. And then 2 days after Germany attacked, Britain and France declared war against Germany over Poland. And it's framed in terms of, see, Hitler attacks, so we have to stop him because who knows where he'll go after this. Well, that's not what accurate. Hitler was actually very disappointed and shocked even that France and Britain declared war. But um, there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy in what France and Britain did. They didn't do it because they thought Germany was evil and had to be defeated. That's not why they did it. They did it because Germany was a rival, and it was had become so economically and even military, but even economically so dominant, especially in Eastern Europe. The leaders in France and Germany were very afraid that unless they stopped, quote unquote, Germany and Poland over this issue, this was going to be very bad. And they miscalculated. That's a very important lesson. Countries almost always miscalculate about wars. It happens no one involved in the First World War, the Second World War, could foresee how those conflicts ended up. And this is true of all these major conflicts. because these are very powerful forces that are set into motion, and it's almost like a throw of the dice how they're going to end. The American Civil War, both sides believed the conflict would end very quickly. Their side would not deal a knockout blow to the other, it'd all be over in a few weeks, and that would be the end. And that's what people thought in the First World War. Almost everybody, France, Germany, Britain, Russia, all these countries felt by Christmas, it was in August it began, by Christmas it'd be over. No, it dragged on, horrible war, it went on for years. Nobody thought the Vietnam War would go on. And certainly the Afghanistan War, which went on for 20 years. Nobody expected the United States would be involved in that. And the same thing in 1939. Now, several weeks after Germany attacked Poland, the Soviet Union attacked from the east. And the British didn't declare war against the Soviet Union. They said that they were declaring war against Germany because Germany had violated Polish sovereignty or independence. Well, they didn't declare war against the Soviet Union, and even people at the time said, well, why not? And, well, one of the reasons is that the treaty that the British had made with Poland had a secret clause that this treaty only applied to Germany, didn't apply to the Soviet Union, even though the Soviets took more of the territory of the Polish Republic at that time than Germany did. Now, I'm not saying Hitler's a good guy. He's not. This is not a question of good guys and bad guys. They're bad guys. And again, at that time, the British London government was by far the most imperialistic government in the world at that time. The British Empire was by far the world's largest empire. And the British Empire didn't grow by just being nice to everybody. It used troops, and it used troops to keep down people. Notably, of course, in India, people in India wanted independence, and the British leaders didn't want to give them independence, and they used force and oppression to try to keep not only India but many other parts of the British Empire under British rule. Now, that doesn't mean the British are evil or bad people and we'd better destroy them. But my point is, these are not good guys or bad guys. And the Soviet Union, which was America's most important military ally during the Second World War, probably in history, was nobody disputes, was by certainly the most oppressive government in the world at that time. And it was not a peaceful government. It was a very rapacious and expansive government. In fact, the Soviet government and its leaders wanted a world union of Soviet socialist republics. I mean, they were driven by an ideology which said the entire world should be basically a Marxist kind of society. Again, this isn't a question of good or bad, but that's the reality. And the United States met, President Roosevelt met twice with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, Soviet dictator Stalin, and with Churchill to do what they accused the Axis of wanting to do. That is, control the world, basically. And even at both of those conferences, Churchill even said, we have the world in our hands. I mean, they were planning out how the world was going to be. And that's how America, Franklin Roosevelt said after the war, we were going to have a new order in which we would dominate. We, meaning Roosevelt, thought the United States and the Soviet Union particularly, but also Britain, not France, by the way, was going to dominate the world. Now, again, this is based on the tremendous power, of course, that the United States and the Soviet Union had at the end of the Second World War. But as leaders in the Axis countries predicted, as soon as the war ended, the United States and the Soviet Union went back to being big rivals themselves. They were, of course, and then came the Cold War. And many people wondered, well, what was the war for if at the end of the war we're actually adversaries, if not enemies, of the country that had been our ally? And again, this has relevance in our own time. I get very indignant, unhappy when I hear American leaders talk about how essential it is that Ukraine be independent, and we're supposed to send troops and military aid so Ukraine is independent. I'd like Ukraine to be independent too, but American leaders didn't care at all, one whit, about Ukraine during World War II, or even the 1950s. It was part of the Soviet Union. And America was just fine with Ukraine and much of Eastern Europe being controlled by Stalin. and we didn't want to go to war over that. If anybody in 1940 or 41 or 42 had said, well, Ukraine and lots of other peoples within the Soviet Union should have freedom, Americans would say, well, you want to get us into another war? Or what's that all
Hmm.
about? But yeah, and also when I was younger, of course, the Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, fell apart. Soviet troops withdrew from Eastern Europe, and many people, I wasn't alone, many people said, well, we've had this huge military in place because of the rivalry of the Soviet Union. Now the Soviet Union's gone. Thank goodness now we can dismantle this enormous military machine, which has been uh, eating up so much billions and billions of dollars for so many years. But that's not what happened. What happened was our leaders found new reasons to not only keep this huge military in place, but to increase it. That's the astonishing thing. I mean, my point is that when a government country believes that its foreign policy should be a kind of a Superman hegemon in the world, you're always going to find new reasons to justify military force. And that's what our leaders have done. And so now Ukraine's become a big thing, and probably that will end at some point, much as America's other recent wars have ended. That is, we will reach some sort of compromise, the Russians will get something, and Ukraine will not get all the territory. And people will say, well, then what was it all for? Why didn't we do that in the first place? And
Hmm.
there's other conflicts. We talk about the Middle East and so on and so forth. So anyway, my point is that World War II was justified because, in these moral terms, because America didn't have any real good reason to be in the war. And I've made the point right before up to Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States in. The Roosevelt government, the United States was doing everything to try to provoke Germany into war. It was giving military aid both to the Soviet Union and to Britain. And of course, Roosevelt himself had already made many speeches saying how America had to destroy Hitler's Germany. Well, but the big point is that was one big thing. America had to justify it by saying, well, it's not a question of national interest, it's a question of destroying the bad guys. Okay, that's one thing. The other one, too, and I know this gets a lot of people very upset, is World War II. Hitler was anti-Jewish, and
Hmm.
he killed a lot of Jews. He did very bad things, and that has played a big role. The Jewish organized community has played a big role in shaping how Americans see the world through motion pictures and so forth. And so that war, it's taken on, that's a big factor in why that particular war and that particular regime is considered terrible because, but most historians will readily acknowledge that Stalin's victims outnumber those of Hitler. But he's not considered bad in the same way because, well, communism's in favor of humanity or at least the world in a way that Germany wasn't. But the big factor is because of this. I think unquestionably that's a major factor, and I don't think I'm saying anything really startling that America's support in recent decades for Israel is a reflection not of some abiding U.S. interest in supporting Israel, or certainly in moral terms, but it's because the organized Jewish community has tremendous clout and influence in our political life by our politicians. And no one was more blunt in making that point than the man now who's being buried, Jimmy Carter. He made that point over and over that American politicians are afraid to speak openly about their relationship with Israel because they will not get reelected. And this is he wrote a book on this subject, and he was in fact ahead of his time. And that's a really tragic thing because our foreign policy isn't even motivated by a consistent so-called moral point of view. It's motivated. It reflects above all the interests of those who have power in American domestic life, in American political life, not what's in the best interests of humanity in the world, or much less the interests of the American people.
Hmm.
So anyway, those are two big factors why I think the Second World War is still looked upon as in a different way than many other wars that the United States has been involved in.
Right, definitely. You can kind of see how the trickle effect of that war led to the foreign policy that we see today, like with the creation of Israel after World War II and sort of the interests of not being that of American national sovereignty per se, with even when we're looking at our conflicts, but this sort of global picture. And would you say World War II was the start of that sort of global outlook and that global shift? Was that
It's
really what?
not it's not the start of it. Already a very decisive uh, milestone in this was the Spanish-American War.
Hmm.
Before that, Americans very strongly agreed the United States should not be an imperial power. We
Hmm.
should stay out of foreign countries. America should tend to its own business. It should have a foreign policy in line with the famous farewell address of George Washington. We should try to cultivate good relations with all countries, but we shouldn't have either a hateful relationship with any country or a passionate attachment to any foreign country. We should not tell other countries how to do their affairs. But there was during the end of the 19th century, the British and the French, Germans, Russians were imperial powers, and that was considered a source of pride and strength. And Teddy Roosevelt and many Americans thought, well, to be a really important country, we have to have an empire too.
Hmm.
And that came up in 1898. Cuba was still controlled by Spain. Puerto Rico was controlled by Spain, the Philippines, and Spain was a weak imperial power. Spain was not a industrial power like Britain or Germany or France. It didn't have a military, and so when an American ship, the Maine, blew up in Havana Harbor in Cuba, American leaders said, oh, this is terrible. Spain is responsible. And they declared war on Spain, or they made war against Spain. Now, historians are unanimous, really, in saying that almost certainly the Maine was not blown up by the Spanish. The Spanish, if anything, wanted to avoid war with the United States. But the United States went to war against Spain and acquired the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and eventually Philippines. I mean, one of the ironies is the Philippines was taken, and the United States did not grant independence to the Philippines. It was taken over as a kind of American colony, and it spent actually more Americans died putting down Philippine freedom fighters in keeping the Philippines under American control after the Spanish-American War than had died in the Spanish-American War. And of course, Puerto Rico was added to the United States. It's, I think, highly questionable whether that was any big advantage, but that was the mood at the time. Now, there was a great deal of debate about that. Many Americans said, no, we shouldn't be an imperial power. We shouldn't acquire people who are not American or European. These are different people. We don't want to ourselves be the very kind of power that we said was terrible when we declared independence. When
Hmm.
America declared independence, it said, no, we're against imperialism. That's why we want to be independent. And but there was a great deal of enthusiasm for the idea, this idea that we're going to be a great, powerful country. And I think we've seen the appeal for many people of this slogan, "Make America Great Again." Well, what does great mean? I guess it means powerful, tough, muscles,
Hmm.
whatever. Anyway, so that, and then the First World War was another milestone. The United States could have stayed out of the First World War. Um, and I don't want to go into a great deal of point about this, but when Woodrow Wilson, who was president, asked for a declaration of war in April 1917, by the way, the war was mostly over by that time. I mean, the war was already had been going on since 1914. When he asked for a declaration of war, he said explicitly, we don't have any real interest in going to war. There's no American national interest at stake. He said, we're doing this to uphold the principle of democracy. We're going to make,
Hmm.
he said, the world safe for democracy. Now, this is really high octane idealism. This is pretty extravagant. And of course, um, uh, afterwards, it came out real. I mean, even at the time, many Americans say, well, we're going to be allied with the British Empire and the French Empire, and there's a lot of other problems. But Americans were very disappointed that after the war was over, it became clear that our allies, the French and the British in the First World War, were interested in just even increasing their empire. They weren't
Hmm.
interested in freedom or democracy. However, sincere Woodrow Wilson had been, they violated those very principles, and the Americans ended up supporting policies after the First World War that were a violation of the very principles that we said we were going into the war. And that's why during the 20s, after the First World War, most Americans felt it was a pretty strong feeling, widespread feeling, that it had been a mistake for us to have been in the First World War. What was it all for? Americans died for what? They didn't die for America particularly. We could have just stayed out of the thing. And many people pointed to the fact that American business interests had lent huge amounts of money to Britain and France, but especially Britain, to pay for war supplies. And the only way that they could make sure those loans were ever repaid is if Britain won. So that was a big financial inducement for the United States to be involved in the First World War.
Hmm.
The Undersecretary of the Navy in the First World War was Franklin Roosevelt, and he was a big believer in this kind of idealistic foreign policy in which America would be the big uh, power in the world, the big hegemon, if you will. And he carried on this Wilsonian idea. He was a vice presidential candidate in what 1920 with Cox, supporting the Wilsonian kind of idea. And he believed this. He believed that America should be not just a country for America or uphold the principles of justice and so forth here in this country, but we should be pushing that around the world. And so he pushed that in the 1930s and 1940s. So anyway, the point is, to answer your question, that's my long answer, is that this kind of idea of America is going to play this big kind of giant role in the world has been around for quite a while, and it makes people like it. It makes them feel good.
Hmm.
We're important, and we're the good guys. I like to compare it to Superman. Superman only proves he's Superman when he's fighting bad guys. When he's not fighting bad guys, he's Clark Kent. He's
Hmm.
just an ordinary guy. And America is just a kind of ordinary country if it just minds its own business. It'll be like Switzerland on a big scale, you might say, something like that. Again, this is exaggerated. I mean,
Hmm.
but the point is, Americans like to think, well, we prove we're good and tough by uh, being showing our strength around the world. I don't want to make this a partisan thing, but I'm very struck that uh, just just in the last few days or weeks, Donald Trump, who wants to make America great again, is now talking, apparently with sincerity, about adding Canada and Greenland to the United States, for gosh
Hmm.
sakes. I mean, that's pretty astonishing, especially because nobody in Canada is apparently in favor of the idea. But anyway, that's pretty astonishing. And because Donald Trump has this idea that great countries, quote unquote, are kind of imperialistic countries, I guess, he thinks, something like that. Maybe that's a normal thing. But anyway, it's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing because it can get into our people and many others into war. And that's one of the big points I make, is that war should be avoided unless there's a very, very good reason for being involved. It
Hmm.
shouldn't be done because we're going to go and beat bad guys and come home and everything will be back to the way they were. Um, One of the reasons America has can that people can think that is because America has no real enemies on our borders. America is this enormously a country of a great abundant resources with two oceans on either side. We're not a vulnerable country in the way that France or Germany or Poland or other countries that have big neighbors on their borders. The United States neighbors are Mexico and Canada, and well, we have fought wars with each of them, but America, for most of our history, has been so much more powerful in population and industrial strength and resources that they haven't been serious rivals of the United States. And so for Americans, wars are something that happens overseas. We
Mm.
send troops off, we have bombers bombing places, and then they come home and life just goes on. That's not what war is for most people. And this is something that has greatly influenced my outlook on history and on life. I was 18 when I first went to Europe, and I talked to many, many people. And I was very quickly it became obvious that for Europeans, and this is true in Japan and other countries, war means something very different than it does for Americans.
Mm.
For Americans, wars happen overseas. It's something like a football team. It can go off and play a game. Win or lose, they come back and life goes on. Even the Vietnam War, it's a terrible war. Many Americans died, tens of thousands. But for most Americans, life went on much the same. For most people in the world, in China, Japan, Poland, Russia, Germany, war means bombs, it means occupation forces, it means huge destruction, it means privation and rationing and bad, bad things. That's not the American experience. During World War II, except for the poor guys who were actually in combat, World War II was a great time. The economy boomed
Mm.
because we didn't have to deal with bombs in our cities the way other countries did. We didn't have the privation. America is blessed with enormous abundance and resources that other countries don't have. Japan, just to give an example in World War II, Japan has no oil, it has no petroleum, it has no sources of minerals, it has not very much arable land. And so for Japan to be a successful country requires much more work and effort than it does here in the United States. Anyway, my
Mm.
point is that Americans look at war differently than other people do. And right now, I'm just very conscious that, of course, the war in Ukraine, which is a horrible thing, and the country people being destroyed the most are Ukrainians. Americans can talk about it very nicely, but we don't suffer anything like the consequences and the privation, the misery, the suffering, and the death of war in the way that people in Ukraine do. And of course, America gives military aid and support to Israel, and Americans would prefer not even to think about the horrible destruction and death that war has brought, of course, to Palestinians.
Right.
But anyway, my point is that we have a different mentality, a different attitude about war compared to how many people around the rest of the world, most people around the rest of the world look at war because we don't suffer the consequences of war historically. The only time, the exception of that is really parts of the South during the American Civil War. That's really
Right.
the only exception that really suffered. Atlanta and uh, parts of South Carolina, Northern Virginia, and so forth. Apart from that, war doesn't really touch us in the same way.
Right, definitely. You can see how that definitely would shape the perceptions of the population on just on what war is. Because if it's not in your backyard, then you're gonna have an entirely different way that you even interact with it or entertain the idea of war. And just to kind of to bring it back into World War II, like if we're looking at so we we've kind of established that we had this almost global interest, in particular in America, but the same thing with the British Empire, and we're looking at the Soviet Union. I mean, if they're not going to fight this evil per se, and we're kind of rewriting the myth and trying to align it more in a, uh, more critically with the truth per se, would the reason for war against Germany then simply be that they were a threat to this idea of a global empire and sort of a global um, I don't want to say a one world government or global governance because, there still is a sense of national sovereignty and more so at that time than I would say now. Um, but was Germany's interest kind of in direct contradiction to the idea of what Americans call global democracy? I don't know if I don't think either you or I would call it that per se, or what the British Empire had in mind for their own imperial ventures or the Soviet Union? Is that why they sort of aligned because there was that direct contradiction, or is it more rooted? Is there like a deeper motivation behind going after Germany in particular?
Well, you're bringing up a very good point. of course, America has been aligned throughout its history with countries that have very, very different forms of government, very
Hmm.
different ideologies. American independence would not have been possible without the support of France. At that time, it was an absolutist monarchy, absolute. The King of France was like a dictator, really. It wasn't even a modified monarchy like Britain, which had a parliament and a tradition that way. It was an absolutist monarchy. But that without the support of France, America would not have been independent.
Hmm.
During the First World War and Second World War, America was allied with the British Empire. Now, Britain, of course, is a democracy in Britain itself, but it's not a democracy. It wasn't democracy in its colonies. They were under British rule, regardless of what the people there really wanted. And and of course, also in the Second World War, the United States was allied with the Soviet Union, which was very, very grotesquely oppressive. Um, but um, but so whether Hitler and the German government World War II was different isn't enough. It was important, really, for American Jews looked at Hitler, of course, as really bad. I mean, and uh, and so you're getting into an important point, I guess, a more subtle point. If Germany could be successful, if Hitler's government could be successful and just continue on, it's a repudiation of the idea that a country has to welcome and have Jews play a big role in order for it to be prosperous or successful. That's a kind of threat to the very existence of a society like that is a very unsettling, very disturbing to American Jews here in this country or anywhere in the world. Um, and so to that extent, that's a factor. That's certainly a
Hmm.
factor. I mean, there was a famous speech made in 1941 by Charles Lindbergh, and he identified three groups that were pushing for war. And this is before Pearl Harbor. He said the Roosevelt administration, the British government, and American Jews. They were pushing for war. And I think there's no real argument about the truth of that. He was criticized because he's making a distinction between Americans full stop, and American Jews. And he's implying that Jews are a group with its own interests and its own agenda. And that's very disturbing for Americans because Americans like to believe, well, um, either sooner or later, everyone will sort of become an American and it'll all sort of work out, and that ethnic and religious or cultural differences should be subsumed into a kind of American common idea. I'm not getting into this whether it's right or wrong, but the point is for Lindbergh to even talk like that, and for Germany to say, well, Jews are a separate kind of people, even though Jewish leaders will say that themselves sometimes about themselves, that's a kind of threat. That's dangerous even to highlight that difference.
Hmm.
Now, since then, I think in recent years, it's become, I think, pretty obvious to most Americans that organized Jewry, the organized Jewish community in America, does have a kind of separate, they have a loyalty to Israel. I mean, every major Jewish organization in the United States is a Zionist organization. They support Israel. And they don't just support Israel, they insist American politicians and the American public should support Israel. Um, well, Israel is a foreign country. It's far less important to America in any objective terms than Mexico or any number of other countries, Japan or any number of other Korea. But and so even to highlight the fact that the Jewish community in America or any place will have interests or agenda or different than that of most people, that becomes very dangerous. Then you start questioning, well, are they different? Are they the same? Are they who do we share even the same goals or idea about the country? And so in 1940-41, Jews, of course, were very unhappy. The very existence of of Hitler's Germany, Third Reich Germany, was a threat in a sense because they're in effect, if it's going to succeed, if it's going to even exist, that's That's a dangerous thing. And of course, Jewish groups have an understandable reason why they don't like even the existence of foreign governments which are anti-Jewish, because that brings up this whole question. Again, this isn't crucial to the point I'm trying to make about how we look at World War II, but it's an aspect of it, I think, that cannot be overlooked.
Definitely. And it's interesting because the nowadays, like you were just kind of talking about in the modern age, you don't I mean, in America in particular, you do have different ethnic groups, and you could say that, I don't know, the black community in America has its own interests, right? You can kind of openly say that. I mean, you have
Right,
groups like Black Lives Matter, and there isn't necessarily controversy when you actually bring that up, but you
right,
start talking about something like Jewish interest, it's like, well, this is its, if they're their own group and their own interests, you point that out in America, it's automatically labeled as anti-Semitism. So it's
right,
very difficult to have that conversation even openly
right,
without it being thrown back in your face in a sense, and it kind of shuts down the conversation before it starts. But if we look at the role of Israel in the modern world, and I think the creation of it after World War II allowed it to become what it is now, to where America really does all of Israel's bidding and provides it with weapons, provides it with arms, and none of that's really up for debate. But I think you do have to go back to World War II and actually look at the creation of Israel and look at, why was it created? I mean, Adolf Hitler it's not like he took up mass extermination, like right when he took office per se. And, he sent them to Palestine, sent them to where modern day Israel, right? And so
yes,
there were
yes.
programs in place to where, um, things you don't necessarily hear about per se,
Yes.
you know.
Well, this point has been made by many people who have, including Jimmy Carter. He
Hmm.
said we can't even have really an open debate, an open discussion about this issue. If you start talking about even the question of, well, does Jewish community have influence in America? You can say, well, America has too much power by white men. Uh,
Hmm.
White men play too big a role in deciding the future of the country. Or you can say blacks don't have enough of a role, or you could say whatever. But it becomes very prickly, very difficult to talk about the Jewish role in American society. Every year the ADL, the Jewish Organization Anti-Defamation League, puts out a survey on levels of what they call anti-Semitism in society. And they determine that by asking people questions. And one of the questions they ask is, do you think Jews have too much power? And
Hmm.
if you say yes, that's considered anti-Semitic. But it's an odd question because it implies that no matter how great the power, it's never enough. It's never too much.
Hmm.
That's a bizarre thing. If you said, "Well, do you think fundamental evangelical Christians have too much say in American life?" People can say, "Well, maybe it's too much, too little," but nobody says if you say it's too much, you're anti-Christian or anti-evangelical Christian. If you think white men have too much society, too much clout or too much say in determining American policy, nobody says, "Well, you hate men or you hate white men." Nobody. I mean, in other words, it's even discussions about the Jewish role in society are not really honest, I think, in American society, and that's one of the reasons why there is now things have changed enormously since October 7th of 2023. People now it's really pretty blatantly obvious that our Congress goes along with Israel for reasons which really don't have to do with humanity or American real interests. Some people justify it on the basis that, well, we have to stand with Israel for religious reasons. They'll give some reasons like this, but the power of that lobby or that organized Jewish community is really obvious, I think, to everyone, and it's also obvious that this notion of Israel being this sort of moral, rarefied, high idealistic society is, well, mythical. That
Hmm.
Israel can carry out policies and does carry out policies that are, by any standard, brutal, harsh. Some people say genocidal, And even to say that now, it's now much. People are saying that much more. I was astonished that a few months ago, uh, a poll showed that even young Republicans are in favor of an arms embargo against Israel.
Hmm.
Young people, especially, they don't regard Israel with this kind of rosy tinted glasses that people of my generation and older did during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Israel today, for much of the world, is virtually a pariah state. As you might know, the International Criminal Court has a warrant out for the arrest of the Prime Minister of Israel. That's a really astonishing thing, especially considering that these institutions, these international institutions, the United States helped set up after World War II. And so, by the very standards that America has proclaimed around the world, Israel is not doing what it should do. It's not a nice country. But anyway, that again, it's so talking about World War II starts bringing up these kinds of issues, these issues that muddy the waters, make it very difficult to talk about it without people getting very emotional and very
Hmm.
finger pointing, you might say.
Right. Well, and I feel like, and I don't necessarily want to speak for the Jewish community, right? But you bring up, if you bring up these subjects, it automatically goes back to something like the Holocaust, or you want to
Right.
exterminate Jews, and I think that that story that we have about that maybe is uh, it's continually told for this very reason, so that
Right.
we're not able to engage in these discussions, right?
Right.
And
Right.
that's maybe some sort of the point of that, because if we're not going to have the discussion because it's too emotional based, or then you don't get to see the truth, and you don't get to actually kind of approach it with objectivity. And just because somebody is talking about the influence of Israel in global affairs today, it doesn't by any means mean that they want to throw Jews in an oven, right? I mean,
Right.
it's
Of
kind of it's
course.
kind of
Of course.
absurd that people, rationalize it to that extreme. But I mean, that's kind of the main, at least within the institutions that you're referring to, that's kind of what it comes back to, and it prevents those discussions. And
Right. Right.
which is unfortunate. I mean, when we're looking at World War II, and actually sort of the vision that, whether it's Roosevelt and Stalin, Churchill, when they had this vision for the world after World War II, right? I mean, with the Jewish interests in America, and this is sort of me just, I guess, thinking on the spot. I don't know what your thoughts are on this. Was that Jewish interest in mind with the creation of Israel for it to become what it is today? Like, were those groups even back then, let's say in America, I've heard people make this claim even back then, they were working on behalf of that interest, right? Like, let's say um, Roosevelt supporting the war because the Jewish community was interested in it, right? There's a lot of people who would see those those three groups advocating for war and automatically assume, especially based on how our politicians act today, oh, they're operating on behalf of this interest group, of the Jewish interest, right? Is
Right.
Was that something that had an actual factor in, let's say Roosevelt's decision making, or when we're looking at like
No.
Churchill? No, it didn't
No.
play a role.
No. 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 I mean, Roosevelt had his own kind of vision about America's role in the world. Sure, the Roosevelt administration was very pro-Jewish. It supported Zionist aspirations, but uh, one common mistake is to think that if something is the way it is today, that's what people intended early on. That's not
Mhm.
necessarily true. And another fallacy, or another kind of mistaken thing, is that people assume that yeah, if something, well, they also assume that whatever the trajectory is of the time, it'll sort of go on and continue on the same way. No, it really came up as an issue not during World War II, but after World War II. After World War II was over, the British were still in control of Palestine. Nobody invited the British to take over Palestine after World War I. Palestine had been part of the Ottoman Empire. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, all that had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and the British and the French divvied it up among themselves during World War I and took over after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire, after World War I. And so the British took over Palestine, and the British government was pro-Israel, but the majority of the population by far was not Jewish, was Arab, was
Mm-hmm.
Palestinian, was Arab. And so the British had to sort of balance this off. They were supporting Jewish interests and they allowed Jews to come in despite what the people there wanted. And but the tension and the violence grew so great that in 1948, Britain was bankrupt by the war. I mean, Britain had been just devastated by the war. Even though they came out of the winning side, they were on their back. And so Britain in 1948 just said, we give up. We can't control this anymore. And they said, we're turning the whole thing over to the United Nations. We're getting out. And at that point, the Zionist organization, the Jewish Agency, declared independence. Now, people knew this was happening. British said, we can't do it anymore. We don't
Mm-hmm.
have the power to ensure security and order in a region now so divided. There was just constant killing, terrorism, and so forth. And at that point, the American government had a choice what to do about this. What would be the U.S. policy? And it's very, I think, very enlightening to trace back what happened at that time. The U.S. Secretary of State at that time was George Marshall. He was highly regarded by people of whatever, both political parties, by most Americans, as a man of great self-control, rectitude, righteousness, patriotism. And he was Secretary of State. He was absolutely against the United States even recognizing a Jewish state. He thought the United States shouldn't even recognize a Jewish state because it had no basis by the population. The population was majority, didn't want a Jewish state. And the head of the policy planning section of the U.S. State Department was against even recognizing Israel. The first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, thought the United States shouldn't even recognize Israel. They believed that this was not only not in America's interest, it was a violation of the principles that we proclaimed around the world of democracy and expression of self-determination. And there was a very fateful meeting at the White House in 1948 in which President Truman at that time and Secretary of State Marshall was called in, along with Clark Clifford, who was Truman's domestic political advisor. And so Truman had Clifford give some reasons why the United States should support Israel. And Marshall got more and more upset by this. And he finally just said, Mr. President, this man shouldn't even be here. This is a foreign policy decision. It should be made on the basis of what's good for America. This man is a domestic political advisor. It shouldn't be based on who has votes or who has power in American politics. And he said, why is he even here? And Truman was taken aback and he said, well, he's here because I asked him to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And Marshall said, if you go ahead and do this, what he says, and you recognize the state of Israel, I don't see how I can support you in the next election. Now, that carried a lot of weight because Marshall, when he spoke, people listened. Also, just before that, a very high ranking member of the State Department, Lloyd Henderson, he wrote a long memo to Truman, and he said, if we recognize the state of Israel, this Jewish state, by the way, it wasn't until the hours before the state was declared that anybody knew what the name of this new country was going to be. Some people wanted to call it Judea. Some people wanted to call it Hebrea. And it wasn't until it was actually declared they decided to call it Israel. But anyway, the new Jewish state. And Lloyd Henderson wrote this long memo to Truman. He says, if we recognize this Jewish state, we'll be committed to it. And we will make their enemies our enemies. That's not in America's interest. It's not good. We're going to be in a permanent, this new Jewish state will be in permanent conflict with its neighbors. And it's not something that we should be involved in. And it's also, of course, a violation of our own principles. They're declaring this Jewish state in a country in which the majority of the population isn't Jewish. They don't want a Jewish state. And uh, what's interesting is that his warnings proved to be prophetic. That's
Mm.
what's happened. And I call the decision by Truman. Truman later said, he said, gentlemen, I have to answer to millions of Jewish voters. I don't have any Arab voters, and I'm going to recognize the state of Israel. In other words, he did it for domestic reasons. He did it because it was good for him or his party, the Democratic Party. The consideration was not what's good for America. And uh, ever since, I call it the original sin of American foreign policy, because
Mm.
that was the first important step of making a policy based not what's on good for humanity or the world or for America, but because of who has power domestically in American political life. And that's a dangerous thing. And we've seen what's happened ever since the United States has been dragged into this situation where we've got to take sides in a region that we don't have any good reason to support Israel strategically. Some people have said that, we have all these enemies in the Middle East. In 1948, America had no enemies in the Middle East, none.
Mhm.
The Arabs were actually much more friendly in their outlook. The world was well disposed to America because, unlike the British or the French, uh, America had never had colonies in the Middle East. The British and the French had, and so America was considered a good guy in the Middle East. But when we did that, when we took sides in that way in 1948 and in the years since then, now not only the Middle East but much of the world regards America as a hypocritical country that you can't even count on its word because it talks a lot about these high sounding, highfalutin slogans, but it's not really carrying out policy even based on that, much less on the kind of normal interests that a country bases its foreign policy on.
Mm, right. And I think that's a really important distinction, like that you were just making, because it's very easy to want to like take the outcome of World War II and say this was the planned outcome all along, right? People like to make these sweeping rationalizations almost. And I think most people don't even realize that was the United States stance on Israel per se, or how much of a debate it was, right? Because,
Yes, that's right.
everybody just kind of assumes, oh, they ended the war, supported Israel, and now here we are today, right?
No, they were separate things. And also, of course, the the American goal in World War II, and this is a point I've written quite a bit about, Americans assumed that we were fighting World War II to sort of protect America, protect our way of life. We'd go back home and life would go on. But
Hmm.
that's not what Roosevelt said. He really believed, or seemed to believe, that he wanted a whole new world order, a new world order dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, in which the United States and the Soviet Union, through the United Nations organization, would disarm the rest of the world. And now he promised what he thought it would be was a world without war, without oppression. He promised a new world in which even fear and want would be eliminated. It was one of
Hmm.
his four freedoms: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom from war. I mean, this is utopian, really. And he thought that he could do this with the Soviet Union. He put tremendous hopes in this United Nations organization. Well, of course, it didn't work like that. Stalin and the Soviet Union had very different goals and different ideas about what the world was going to be like than Roosevelt. And so American, you could say, it was a major defeat, really, in terms of what the goals that Roosevelt said the war was being fought for,
Hmm.
and also. Uh, um, Winston Churchill wrote a six-volume history of the Second World War, and it's a very major work on. I mean, it was his. He once said, "History will be kind to me." He says because I'll write the history. Well, he wrote a lot of history, and it has been kind in many ways. But he writes in the book at the very beginning of the book, he said that the great tragedy of the Second World War, and this is Churchill, is that after all this suffering, after all this sacrifice, we are now confronted with greater dangers than we were when the war began. That's an
Mm,
astonishing admission. Remember, Britain had declared war on Germany in 1939 because Polish independence had been violated. Well, at the end of the war, Poland was under the control of the Soviet Union. It was certainly not free again. It didn't finally get rid of the Soviets until 1990 or whatever. But my point is that even Churchill was very aware of the tragedy of that the war turned out to be very, very different than he or anybody expected. And certainly it did not succeed. It did not succeed in achieving the goals that he hoped. He also said at the very beginning, when he became prime minister in 1940, that he talked over and over about how he wanted to defend the British Empire. Well, of course, Britain was so weakened by the war that its empire basically fell apart very quickly. And in 1947, 48, uh, the countries that we now call India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh had all been lost. And then very soon, the rest of the British Empire, Malaysia, Nigeria, all these other British colonies were lost. And that could have been foreseen. Some people did foresee this. But again, this is another example about how wars turn out very differently than anyone expected at the beginning.
right, definitely. And I think the whole um, good guy, bad guy war argument or just story really falls apart, even when you just start looking at what was the actual impact of World War II on the people who were living in, Britain, France, Germany, Poland, all of these countries, were completely decimated, completely destroyed. They went bankrupt afterwards, right? And then you look
Right,
at who are we aligning ourselves with? Well, we're aligning with the Soviet Union, which, if you look at the numbers, it's at least 20 million killed by the Stalin regime. At minimum, you're talking it might be upwards of 100 million. The numbers are kind of all over the place, but an absolute brutalist, terrible regime by all standards, and that's who the United States allied with, right? And so
right,
this
right,
this this whole idea of it being a just war and it being for the good of humanity, I really think that in itself just falls apart when you just even when you don't even take into account what happened after and everything we've been talking about. When you look at the total devastation and you look at the players in it and you start talking about these motivations, the whole narrative that we've been fed about World War II, it really is just one big lie in the it's just to put it bluntly, and
mhm,
the motivations behind that lie. I mean, it kind of comes into what we've been talking about, but it really puts into perspective if World War II in itself, the story we've been told about it is heavily fabricated. What does that say about the rest of our history? What does that say about the events of World War II? What does that say about after World War II, right? Because that seems to
mhm.
be, at least in if you're going to call it like American mythology and the stories of America, that's almost it's the one event that there is a you could say almost a consensus on what the story is. But once you start questioning the story itself, even that starts falling apart. And I think the trickle down of effect of that can really shape people's perception in a different way on how they actually start to understand America and American foreign policy and looking at the impacts of it because it really was a turning point, I think, globally for how we are all operating now. And you can see the seeds that were planted in World War II, how they've come to fruition in a lot of different ways, mostly you could say for better or worse, but mostly for worse if we're looking at our own national interests.
Right. Well, you've touched on a number of very important points, and it brings us back again to what a point I made at the beginning, that uh, this is all the more confusing because we're in a kind of crisis now, and people are trying to ask, well, how did we get here? What happened? Where did it go wrong? And more and more people ask the question, well, it didn't start with Donald Trump or Joe Biden, or I mean, something was wrong with the trajectory much further back than that, and that's very much worth seeing. We have an interesting review on our website of a book in which a British fellow asked many people who had fought in Britain during the Second World War what they thought of their country, and overwhelmingly, these people felt that they'd lost their country. They don't like the immigration. They don't like what's happened to their country. The Britain that they loved, the Britain that had been in place for a long time, has disappeared. And it's a tragedy. It's terrible, really. I mean, many people in Britain. London is not the city it used to be, and there's much more to be said about that. But yes, and again, I'm bringing it to the American context. Older people just wonder, well, what happened to this country? And uh, I the U.S. government reported, or some agency reported, that the number of homeless in the year 2024 went up 18%. That's a shameful thing, really. People
Mhm.
look around, they say, well, this is not what we fought for. This is not what the kind of country we want. Um, and people have questioned many other wars. I remember, well, when I was young, how the Vietnam War was justified in terms of comparing Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam to Hitler. We had to stop him. He was going to take over this, and next thing you know, he'll take that, and so on and so forth. The irony is that today, the United States and Vietnam are on very good terms with each other. Stores are filled with products made in Vietnam.
Mhm.
We're on very good terms. And so even a simple person said, well, what was the whole point of the war then? I mean, what was it all for? And again, especially younger people, they just know we have a wreck of our foreign policy. It's embarrassing. Even Democrats, the Biden administration, it's obvious they're embarrassed by their support for Israel. It's embarrassment. And they sort of hope the thing will end soon. And everybody sees this. Everybody sees this. And it makes us question, well, how did we get into this? And this is, again, how I go back to the importance of a realism-based foreign policy. It has to take into account who people, how they really are. We're not going to turn Afghanistan into New England. It's not going to
Mhm.
be that way. Yeah, maybe women aren't going to vote, but we can't make over the world as we would prefer it to be. That's not going to happen. We're not going to change China or Afghanistan or Peru or Nigeria the way we think it ought to be. But this idea that the world should be like the United States was a big factor in many Americans' idea of what our foreign policy should be. But now, with the problems that we have, very few people anymore think America has anything like the ability to make other countries conform anymore.
Mhm.
And that's at least real, that's good. To that extent, some delusional ideas and wishful thinking, I might say, at least has given way to a far more sober and realistic view of the world. But where we go from here is still a big question that Americans are very divided about. And I certainly don't believe or even uh, I'm not very happy about politicians who say we're going to make America quote unquote great again. I'd like it just to be a normal country would be fine for me.
Mhm.
But anyway, that's I think most Americans would share that. But so and the Biden administration is equally guilty. When he took office 4 years ago, he said America once again will be take its place as a leader in the world, as the leader of the world, he said. Well, I'd like America just to be a normal country in the world, not the quote unquote leader. But it's very hard to be a leader when our own foreign policy is as confused and contradictory, even hypocritical as it has proven to be in recent years.
Right, definitely. And you kind of took the words out of my mouth because I was going to ask you, where do we go from here? Because it's like we have these vested interest groups deep, for the military industrial complex so deeply rooted within our systems. There
That's
isn't
right.
there isn't going to be an end in sight even under the Trump administration with,
Right.
in regards to support of Israel, right? And we seem to be sort of on this tiptoe towards maybe another major global conflict of some sort. I mean, obviously, we hope it doesn't come to that, but with there's escalating tensions, there's the way Israel is, stomping through other territories and expanding their own influence, and we have Ukraine and Russia obviously over there doing their thing. So, I mean, what do you think it's going to actually take to because these groups aren't just going to stop what they're doing, right? But what is it
Right,
actually going to take to have some real accountability and reflection within within the politicians, the political systems? Because even if the majority of people are starting to kind of see through it, it isn't necessarily stopping the machine itself
right,
from powering forward anyways, right? So,
right. Right. No, these are very good points you're raising. And I think, unfortunately, it'll take a real whack in the head to make people change
mm,
because both of our parties still are in favor of these enormously bloated military spending at a time when we have these problems here. Both parties are guilty of running up enormous debts, which is in effect a way of saying, we're going to carry on our lifestyle by putting it all on a credit card and handing the bill to our children and grandchildren.
mhm,
This is all really bad and foolish, and both parties are guilty because our system of government, unfortunately, means that politicians get elected by doing things that are going to be that will be uh, people will vote for in the short run with no real concern about the long-term consequences. That's a very bad feature of the American political system. But that's I just know that historically, when a country is living beyond its means, when it is overstretch, you might say, overreach, when it's trying to do much more than it's able to financially, militarily, the consequences are very, very bad. And
yeah,
historically, that's what happens when empires lose sight of their real place in the world. The health of a society is not how powerful its military is. That might be an expression of power, but it's not its source of power. The source is its own internal cohesion, its own wisdom of its leaders. That has to come from inside the country. And if the country itself is confused, divided, distrustful, uh, it cannot carry out policies which are going to be successful in the long run. And I just foresee some very bad wake up things happening. Really difficult lessons are going to be put, and Americans have to get ready to it. Something in the same way how the people in Britain have had to live with the demise and the disappearance of their empire. It's disappeared. Or people in Russia, the Soviet Union, the old Tsarist empire have disappeared. They've gone down. And Americans have to, I think, will be forced to, I bet is a better way to put it, be forced to come to a new realization so that politicians who are promising, as I mentioned, either in the case of Trump or Biden, that we're going to be this big sort of Superman in the world, that is not only unrealistic, it's dangerous. It has will have very bad consequences.
right, definitely, and I agree 100%. And I think maybe that's the type of wake up call that can only bring change. That's the only thing that's actually going to bring change. And unfortunately, that does mean more homelessness, more crime, more despair, more what unfortunately, and it might mean more conflict and death, which is not what anybody wants. But if this is the direction we're moving in, I think all we can do is kind of reclaim
I'll,
our own independence and
I'll
sovereignty.
add just one other thing. It's all especially difficult in America because unlike many other countries, China, Japan, Germany, Turkey, we've had the same flag, the same currency, at least in name, in nominally the same constitution for 230, 240 years in place.
Hmm.
It's very difficult for Americans to envision anything radically different than some version of what we've had. And for most of that time, America was doing very well. America was on an upward trajectory. And so it's very difficult for countries that have had the same system in place for a long time when that has been successful or prosperous or good for a long period to really change. Um, this is China. The Qing dynasty had been in place for centuries before it was finally came down in 1912. There were signs that it was internally very weak. There were big problems, but the Chinese leaders more or less took the view that, well, we're so important, we've been so important for so long. It was very they didn't want to make any major changes, and Americans can. One thing I learned in Europe, I lived in Europe for a few years. Europeans can talk and have some sense of different forms of government. They've had different flags, different currencies in place. Many of the countries in Europe have been occupied by one power or another over the years, by the Soviets, by the Americans, by the Germans, by British, whatever. And so they have a sense that whatever the present system is not written in stone. It's not the final word. Americans have a hard time imagining anything really radically different than some version of what we have had. And so people are still trying to make the system work when something, I think it's more and more obvious, there's something really defective about the way we have been doing things, and it should change in some very radical way. But that's very difficult for Americans to see. So that's a special reason why looking to the future in a really different way is very difficult in our country.
Right, definitely. And I think in order to do that, at least on an individual level, I'd said I would tell people to come into alignment with their own values and what they believe in, see where the American system does not align with those values, and then envision something that we can create that, maybe it's based off the Constitution. It doesn't mean you have to throw the document out the window, but a way of governing that is not so intrusive upon other parts of the world, you know, blowing
Right,
money left and right, and something that is more morally in alignment, I think is something we could all
right.
strive towards at
And
the end of the day.
especially when I talk with younger people, that's kind of their view. I mean, younger people, especially, they sort of feel, well, I've got to get my own life as best I can in order, and they've given up in thinking, well, how these big things can be, because nobody has a ready answer. Nobody has a
Mhm.
really good answer. And so I see that that's a process I see, especially among many younger people. But there is definitely a very, very strong feeling, especially of younger people, that these wars overseas, that is not a good way for America to go. That is not good. And people, younger people especially, are very conscious of the tremendous problems here at home. And so going off to be saving other countries is very, very different. The attitude is very different about that than it was when I was young.
Right, for sure. And I've definitely seen that in the people I'm interacting with. And,
Right.
because I'm 29, so it's like my age group and, a little younger, a little older. I think we're kind of right where you're talking about. And so
Right. Well,
this,
I have a daughter who's almost exactly your age, and
yeah.
yeah, I have a son who's in his 20s. I mean, and younger people. They see this all very, very
Mhm.
differently than my generation, and certainly Biden or Trump or any of those people. Yeah.
Right, for sure. Well, Mark, this has been a fantastic conversation. I mean, we're at about an hour and a half, and it
Okay.
kind of flew through.
Very
Um,
good. Yeah.
so, where would you send the listeners to,
Oh
if
well,
they
of
want to
course I
further,
want.
further interact with your work, whether it is, the Institute's website, or if you have any, books or ideas you wanted to throw out there to kind of continue down this exploration that we were kind of focusing on today.
Well, our conversation has been so engaging, I have failed to shamelessly promote our own work. And so I urge people to check out our website, Institute for Historical Review. The website is ihr.org, and you'll find a lot there. Use the search engine, you'll find a whole lot of articles. And I'll go back to a point you made earlier that Google deliberately suppresses our website, and I don't want to go into the reasons or the details of it, but check out our website, please. We also have another website. We sell a whole lot of books and discs and so forth. I have a one web page that I've set up of recommended reading for people who on different whole range of subjects that people find interesting, including Second World War, including books I recommend on that subject. But there's a lot on the issues that we've talked about here during this very um, engaging session.
Awesome. Yeah. And I would encourage all the listeners to head to your website because the work that you do, I think, is very important to actually, because I'm all about on this show is, let's uncover the truth. Let's see what's actually driving the ship per se, right? And your work is, I think, you're one of the few historians I found who is rooted deeply in committing to that and to the truth and to just see the full perspective. So, I really applaud all that you're doing and,
Thank you.
and taking on because I know there's been the attacks and the censorship and the defamation of character in your institute. So to kind of
Right.
navigate as you have and just keep forward, I applaud it. I think that's the type of courage and strength we all need to have, especially once we start going into these types of subjects, because the controllers of the world don't like when we start discussing things outside of their narratives and framework. So
Right.
I definitely applaud your work, Mark, and appreciate all that you do to shine that light and spread the truth. It's
Well, thank you very much.
definitely
Yeah.
needed. And
You've been
thank you to all the listeners for tuning in as well. And I hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. And we will see you all on the next show. Special thank you to Mark for coming on the Fifth Dimension. I would encourage you guys to head on over to the Institute of Historical Review's website. The link is in the episode show notes below. A lot of great articles, a lot of great resources on there. And you can really see the full body of work that Mark has put out there, and he's been putting out there for many, many years now. So special thank you again, Mark Weber, for coming on the Fifth Dimension. This will not be the last time you guys see him on the show. If you're a fan, subscribe, whatever platform you are on. You can head on over to my Substack, mcdermott.substack.com. Do have some tarot offerings if you are interested in working one-on-one. My poetry book is now available as an ebook. Be sure to download that. It is free. And special thank you to our one and only sponsor, Tranquil Desires. It's going to wrap up this episode. I will see you all next time. So long.